So thank you for having me here on a Friday afternoon where it's beautifully sunny outside in Tampa. And so I will do my best to run through these and make it interesting. So Ferg asked me to talk about food waste in the home, which was a little bit of a pivot from what I'm used to talking about, because as running parts of R&D and sustainability at a major food manufacturer, I spend a lot of time thinking about how to reduce food waste in our operations. And so thinking about, and I talk about that a lot, I do a lot of presentations around that. And so making my comments really specific to in the home made me kind of step back and rethink about it. So hopefully you'll find this interesting because it's the first time I've ever presented sort of in this vein. So I'll just jump in. So first of all, I wanted to kind of set the stage on why this is so important to a food company, a food manufacturer, and for me personally. So I'll kind of take you a little bit through kind of how we got to this being a strategic priority for Conagra Brands. So any of you who may have looked at our corporate citizenship report over the years, these 4 themes are the things that really drive our corporate citizenship or social responsibility agenda. It's having a better planet, which is really all about the environmental impacts, better food, which is about nutrition, food availability, how we talk about and label our foods, the kind of claims we make, stronger communities, which is about the people, so our suppliers, our manufacturers, the communities around the plants where we operate, and then responsible sourcing, so really digging into our supply chains. How do we get to responsible and sustainable sourcing in terms of animal rights, human rights, and the environmental input in our supply chain. And so with those 4 key themes, what we did is an assessment called a materiality matrix, where we went and we looked at the vertical axis is the interest to external stakeholders, and the horizontal is how important it is to us as a company in terms of how many brands is it in, how many dollars do we spend to supply it, how critical they are to our success and our reputation, all those kinds of things. So you can see food waste hit right smack dab in the middle and not too far off from things like climate change, and of course food safety and health and nutrition are always at the far nexus of where we need to go. And so clearly it was something that we wanted to focus on as a corporate strategy. So that's kind of the why it's so important to us. And so I think I'm kind of glad the individual from USDA wasn't here because I can talk about this slide a little bit more. I think that would have been a lot of the content in his presentation. But really, to me, running sustainability and being involved in this space for as long as I have, I always think about it as the 3-legged stool of economic, social, and environmental impacts. And food waste is the most egregious offender of all of these for a food company. So in terms of economic impact, who can afford to throw away 25 to 40% of what you make? If you were an automotive manufacturer, can you imagine running off the end of an assembly line and dumping every 4th car into a landfill? That's kind of what we do with food. And so it's a really big economic impact. Socially, Ferg talked a little bit about having enough calories. Well, we have more than enough calories to feed every U.S. citizen, but yet we have children and adults that are food insecure. And then environmentally, which is really my wheelhouse, and the input side, we have all the land, the water, the chemicals, the energy to run the farm equipment, all of that stuff gets lost when we don't get the food to the right purpose. And then on the output side, when you throw it away, it goes into a landfill, and people think about biodegradation as great. Well, it's not. Not in a landfill, it's not, because when you degrade something in anaerobic conditions, you create methane gas, which is incredibly potent greenhouse gas. So it's thinking about all of those inputs and outputs and why food waste is such an egregious waste for us. So one of the things that we did many, many years ago, almost 10 now, we adopted EPA's food recovery hierarchy to think about how do we as a food company manage food waste. And I promise I will get to the consumer in a minute, but I wanted to kind of get to our journey first. And so this food recovery hierarchy has been around for a while, and many folks are starting to use it now. And it really talks about you want to go down the hierarchy in terms of retaining value of food. So first of all, you want to not make it in the first place, which is source reduction. And that's one that's really obvious for a food manufacturer, because if you don't create the waste, you're not buying ingredients that don't get sold for profit. So those are yield improvements and some of those things in the plants. Number two, feed people, which is obvious. So finding ways to donate food that may not have been as obvious. Food manufacturers have been donating to Feeding America and other food recovery networks for decades, but it's almost exclusively been packaged foods that were unsaleables or lightly damaged. That's just a common methodology. A few years ago, we started looking further into our manufacturing practices of where did we have partially processed, work in process, ingredients that were perfectly safe, but they were either discontinued or we couldn't use them for some reason. How could we preserve those in a way that a food bank or a food rescue organization could gain value from that? And we started donating some of those WIP and partially processed materials back in 2008, and it was been a really great opportunity for us to find value in manufacturing. And then the third is animal feed, which for food manufacturers, that's where most of our waste goes. It's pretty easy to feed cattle and pigs and chickens with some of the byproducts that come out of our operations. Industrial uses is mostly energy, so fermentation or anaerobic digestion, composting and land application for things that are really wet, generally speaking, and then we try not to landfill anything. So this recovery hierarchy is sort of our roadmap to how we think about food waste in manufacturing. And so one thing I just wanted to mention is, I'm not sure if it was in my bio or not, but there's an organization that's sponsored by the Grocery Manufacturers Association, the Food Marketing Institute, and the National Restaurant Association called the Food Waste Reduction Alliance. It was formed in 2012 by those three trade associations and a handful of member companies from each. And in 2014, we published a best practices guide that thinks about how can you reduce food waste in restaurants, retailers, and food manufacturers. We updated it in 2016. We're going to update it again this year. That's in process, but it's a really, really good resource to be thinking about what are some of the policy tools, what are some of the practices, what are some things that people have said, oh, you can't do that. Well, guess what? A lot of people are doing some of those things. So this is a really good resource. I thought I'd just pop into the deck. So now I'm going to switch to what Ferg actually asked me to talk about. So thinking about in-home, I was thinking about food processing, packaging, technology, all the stuff that we control. And so why is that important? So this is this is a chart that came out of the FWRA, the group I just mentioned. They, we commissioned a survey from BSR, did a bunch of, which is Business for Social Responsibility. It's a consulting nonprofit. They did a whole bunch of data analysis for us on sources of food waste, scale of food waste. This is from EPA and other data from back in 2010 to 2012, because we really wanted to understand what the scope of the problem was. And you can see that if anybody follows food waste in the mainstream media, there's a lot of darts that get thrown at retailers for all of the waste that happens at, fresh produce. You put up these beautiful displays and half of it goes to waste. Well, you know what? In the grand scheme of things, it's only about 2% of the total. Because they do a really good job. They're not a very high margin business. It's visible, so you can see it, but it's really not huge in terms of scale. And they also do a really good job of donating their damaged or distressed products for the most part. Industrial, I mentioned, we send a tremendous amount to animal feed, which is interesting in a couple of ways. One, it's interesting because we divert product for higher use from a landfill. It's also interesting because we displace ag commodities that would have to be purchased to feed those animals. So if they didn't have the byproducts from food manufacturing, they would have to grow more silage or corn or whatever to feed those animals. So there's a balance in there for for feeding livestock in the U.S. So the big thing that I really want to talk about is if you look at the the red piece of the pie, almost half of food waste comes at the residential place. And a lot of that comes from things like, spillage, spoilage, plate waste. Plate waste is an interesting one because it really has a lot of reasons behind it. And what we found is we've talked to consumers and we've done some demographic work on this with the FWRA, is a lot of the plate waste comes from recipe failure. So people make things that their families don't like, the recipe didn't work out right, or they made too much and they didn't store the leftovers properly, so a lot of that got thrown away. So a lot of it comes from poor planning, recipe failure, and poor packaging in some cases. So you have something that molds or spills or goes stale because it doesn't seal properly. So I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. So here's kind of the 4 buckets in terms of an agenda for technology in home. I'm going to first talk about product design, and then this is some of the content that's super new to me, so I hope you find it interesting around technology that consumers use, managing unavoidable wastes, and then something to leave you thinking over cocktails later. Okay, so product design levers. I was thinking about this in terms of, as we design new products, what are the levers that we use that can help consumers avoid waste without, doing a bunch of advertising and telling them that they're doing bad things? How do we make it just obvious that they won't waste as much food? So we talk about the food. Number one, you got to make it taste good, because if it doesn't taste good, people aren't going to eat it. So that goes to, if consumers have recipe failure, we can have recipe failure too. So if we put out a single-serve frozen meal and consumers don't like it, they're not going to eat it. And so number one is you got to make the food taste good. We also use the lever of single-serve quite often. We find that a very effective technique in terms of portion control, is a really good way to make the portion the right size so that consumers can reasonably enjoy the food without having to restore it. And then, more and more often, and I think, Ferg alluded to this a little bit, this idea of clean label. I personally don't care for that term because I'm not really sure what it means. But having things that are products that appeal to a broader sense of consumers so they don't feel guilty or they feel permissive, they feel like the food is permissible. They don't feel guilty about eating it because it doesn't have things in it that they don't want to consume. And then another section, the middle box, is really near and dear to me because I have the food processing team in my organization, is how do we make it safe? So how do we process the food to make it safe and last a really long time so that consumers have the flexibility to eat it when they're ready to or when they need it to be available in their pantry, fridge, or freezer? And so very traditional techniques obviously work, and you guys probably all know this as well as I do. Freezing, aseptic processing, canning, they're all those common techniques that we've all used for years, but they're often maligned as being processed foods. Well, those things really do a really great job of making sure that the product gets to the consumers in a safe way with a shelf life that works. And then some of the emerging techniques that we've been following, there are new technologies like microwave processing, high pressure processing, things like MATS and MAPS, which are microwave assist processing. So very interesting new techniques that we're looking at, and other companies are launching some cool products that may feel like they're less processed than a can, but they also need a lot of validation to make sure that they work. And then old is kind of new again. All of a sudden, everybody's talking about pickling and fermentation and smoking and some of those techniques that have been around forever, but they're kind of getting sexy in the culinary world. And so those, again, are technology levers that can help reduce food waste by, again, preserving the food and extending the shelf life. And then packaging. Packaging is often maligned as well because of the waste that you get from the package at the end of the day. Early in my career in sustainability, I did a lot of work on packaging, and I did a lot of work on life cycle analyses. And one of the things that really surprised me early on in that journey is every single life cycle assessment I saw in a packaged product system, the package was less than 10% of the total environmental impacts of the finished good. And that's because when you consider food waste and the ag impacts of growing the food, that's where the real meaty environmental impact comes with food production. So I'm not here to say that packaging shouldn't be thought about and there shouldn't be sustainable packaging strategies. What I'm saying is, hey, you need to balance the utility of the package with the function it provides and the benefits that it provides. And so things like extended shelf life that you see with a multi-layer barrier film, those things help with storage conditions in store and in home. Reclose features, I mentioned spillage before. Portion control I mentioned, dispensing features so that when you're pouring salad dressing, you don't get half the bottle when you only want a couple of tablespoons. That's a form of waste because that doesn't get consumed. Cooking features like microwave acceptors, they help the food taste more delicious. And so they might look like they make the packaging more complicated, which might affect its end of life scenario. But again, it's there to deliver a function with the food. And then packaging is also a vehicle for labeling. So telling people how to preserve the food, how to store the food, how to prepare the food so that the product is a success. And then one of the things that's very emerging, and I don't know how well they're going to work in the short term, but we'll see, is there's a lot of sensor techniques going out there. One of the pros of that is it can help consumers who don't have that long ingrained common sense about food and food safety and food security. And food freshness, but sensors can often help consumers get a trigger if something has gone bad. What concerns me a little bit about this technology is if the package becomes the only way that consumers make those decisions, there's a liability that could be assigned to that would really need a lot of validation before companies would want to jump down that path. But so all of these things are things that food manufacturers think about every time we design a new product or we're going to optimize our portfolio. Okay. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about technology at the home. So how many of you guys have Alexa or something like it, right? Okay, so it's about right. About 25% of consumers live in smart homes with things like Alexa, Echo Dot, et cetera. The projection is in 5 years that'll more than double. I'm an anomaly. I'm a tech geek. I'm an engineer, and I love technology. I don't have one because they just frankly annoy me. I don't want to talk to a thing on my counter. It's hard enough to talk to my kids. But so I think they're really, really cool in that one of the things that I think that's really neat about this technology is everybody's got an app. I left my phone sitting over there, but I've probably got 50 apps on my phone. I've got the Food Network app. I've got the USDA Food Keeper app, which is one I was hoping our colleague from the government would talk about a little bit. I have all these apps that help me with that success to avoid recipe failure, right? I love to cook, and I think a lot of millennials are starting to get that bug as well, but they just don't have the skill set. And so now you have things like, I don't know if you can see in this bottom picture here, that's Google Home. And if any of you have seen the ads on TV where the young lady's got a date, she calls her dad walks her through how to, save her date because, she burnt the duck or whatever it is she was making. And so those kinds of apps are really, really catching on. And so I think this is an interesting place for food manufacturers and folks in our industries to deal with, is how do we connect with the hardware on the retailers? How do we get in the Alexa world so that, when people are interested in putting together a recipe, that they're looking for our ingredients? Hunt's tomatoes are a great example. If you need canned tomatoes, I sure want them to buy mine. And so it's a really interesting dynamic with all of these apps and how the apps are using branding and using marketing to pull in different techniques. So I found this to be a really interesting approach that everything's connected and interconnected. And we've struggled a lot with that Food Waste Reduction Alliance I talked about earlier. How do we get the consumer involved given the impacts of where the waste comes from? And all the traditional techniques of whack them over the head with it, you're wasting too much food, stop doing it, that's not going to work. Because those aren't, I mean, everybody says, oh, it's a terrible thing, but I'm not doing it. Because nobody wants to own it in their own space. They all think the neighbor's doing it worse. So I think the only way we're going to solve this with consumers is through technology that makes it hard for them to waste food because you've made it delicious and safe and convenient, and find ways that, you know, they don't create it in the first place. And so moving in, it's some of the things that I think are really interesting about the various technologies and apps is it really helps with planning so that you're getting the right ingredients and foods in your house to start with. It's the shopping, the Peapods, and all of the e-commerce that's happening right now. The interesting thing, I did an experiment with my husband a couple of weeks ago, and I said, we were so busy getting ready for the holidays, I'm like, let's just order from the Mariano's website and go pick it up. And I don't know how often I'm going to do it because I really like to pick my own produce and some things, but they did a really good job. And what I really noticed that was a takeaway for me is I only got what I ordered, which is great because when I send my husband to the store, he does the primary grocery shopping, he comes home with 2 bags of stuff that were not on the list. And I'm like, I just spent 3 days baking Christmas cookies and you brought Oreos home? What were you thinking? And so, you know, that's the cool thing about the shopping app is you only get what you order. You don't buy the things when you're walking through the store that they're impulse purchases that in many cases are going to end up in the trash bin. So I think that is an interesting development in our culture as well. And then preparation, again, recipe, failure, big problem. And so how do I be successful as a cook? And some of these apps, this one in particular was interesting, is it step by step, how to do it, how to knead, how to saute, how to do all the things that, aging myself, I learned in home ec in high school that kids just don't know. They haven't cooked with their grandparents. And so, you know, these kinds of apps I think are, you know, part of this connected kitchen and will end up being on your refrigerator or, you know, even if you don't have a Google Home or whatever the technology is that people prefer. Okay, so now I'm going to shift to that issue of unavoidable waste. So no matter how good you are at planning, prep, shopping, et cetera, there's going to be unavoidable wastes. Nobody's going to eat banana peels. We're not going to eat eggshells. We're not going to eat chicken bones. There are places that we have unavoidable wastes that we're going to have to deal with. Today, your options are really garbage disposal, trash bin, or if you're really green, you might do some composting in your backyard. Or if you live in a couple of specific cities like Seattle or San Francisco, you might have curbside pickup. And so one of the things I was thinking about as I was preparing for this talk is why couldn't we use the EPA food recovery hierarchy to think about how do we help people in home? And so, you know, I was just kind of thinking about some of those things that we could do. So obviously source reduction, that's a big connection with the stuff I was just talking around planning and recipe success. Donation's an interesting one. There's a whole bunch of cool apps for companies, retailers, and food manufacturers to connect sources of feeding opportunities with users. So there's an app called Spoiler Alert that's really cool. General Mills is using a really cool app to connect some of those. It's a newer one. I forget the name of it. But there's a whole bunch of apps that work for business. There's not a whole lot that really work for consumers because if you think about, you know, the small amount that consumers create at home, you're not going to, you know, take that to your local food bank and donate, you know, a half a loaf of bread or whatever there is. So that one's a little squishy still. Most of us can't afford to have pigs or chickens in our backyard, so feeding animals is not really very reasonable either for most of us. But there are places that we could play in numbers 4 and 5. So industrial uses and composters. Interesting, there's a company in Australia who's actually building small-scale anaerobic digesters for people's backyard use. And so that's the picture here on this side of the screen. And the idea is that folks can take their food waste and any organics, including yard waste, put them into a back-home anaerobic digester, and then pipe it to their stove to cook their food. So early, but those kinds of things could happen. I could actually envision innovation in some, chemical or mechanical engineering program at a university that says, how do I do this in an appliance the size of a microwave that somebody would put on their kitchen counter, right? So those kinds of technologies, I think, are really ripe for research and investment. And then the last one would be home composting. So these are actually photos of things that I personally have. I had that home composter, and I tried for years and years to get good compost out of it living in Nebraska, and it just didn't work. And so a couple of years ago, it was hard. It was really hard work, and it was difficult to get good compost out of it. So a couple of months ago, I found this other contraption that is about the size of a microwave. I saw it on Facebook one day. My husband's like, "You're really going to order that?" Because I'm the guinea pig for this stuff. I order all the, I have to try the new thing, and it works. It's not very big, and you have to run it every single day if you cook. But when you're done, it dehydrates and breaks up any of the organics that you put in it, and then you can sprinkle it in your garden as it's not truly compost. It's dehydrated and broken into small pieces, but it works really great as a fertilizer. And so in the wintertime, when I can't put my food waste in with my yard waste, we use this contraption. Again, it's clunky, but these kinds of things can really help consumers that want to, that are aware of what they're doing, and they want to not put it in their trash bin or down their garbage disposal. There are things that are being developed that I hope someday will be commonplace in people's homes. How am I doing on time? Am I good? Okay, so here's the something to think about slide. About a year and a half ago, a group called the FLW, the Food Loss and Waste Protocol, was created by World Resources Institute to put together a framework for how to measure and report on food waste. Incredibly detailed and complicated. Go to the website and you'll see what I mean. But it's also very useful in terms of creating the language around food waste. How do we talk about food waste? How do consumers think about it? How do manufacturers think about it? And a number of us that were involved in the Food Waste Reduction Alliance were kind of co-authors and had some opportunities to give feedback on it. And the one thing that was the most contentious in all the months that we worked on this protocol was this notion of edible versus inedible wastes. And it was really interesting how the protocol allowed individuals and companies to decide how they wanted to categorize their waste streams, whether it was edible or inedible. And we had these absolutely fun, robust debates around things like potato peels. Back then, Lamb Weston was part of Conagra Brands, so potato peels were really important to me at that time. And the idea that potato peels, if you were, say, McCain at the time, they could call that inedible waste. But I would argue at home, I eat the potato peel because that's where all the nutrients are, right? You guys know that better than I do. And so we had this whole discussion around the cultural norms around edible versus inedible. I put on here potato peels, and I also put carrot greens. Carrot greens are delightful in a salad, but most people would call them inedible parts. And so I think the thing I wanted to kind of leave you to noodle on a little bit and think about is how do we think about our cultural norms and what we consider edible versus inedible, and is there a way for us at some point as we tie in sustainable diets to the dietary guidelines and thinking about how do we use science to inform, what we talk about, what we think about in the public domain, is there a way to use science and nutrition and food safety to kind of change the paradigms or what we would consider inedible in our culture. So that's the gist of it. So I wanted to leave you something to kind of think about there. And then just some parting thoughts around product design as a lever, connected consumers as a lever, how do you deal with unavoidable, and then challenging social norms. So that's all I have for you. I will take any questions if you have them.